Welcome to another lecture on Middle East politics. I'm Dr. Bufano here with East Tennessee State University. For our eighth lecture in this series, I'm going to be talking about the beginnings of European imperialism, and it's going to be a continuation of our unit on modernization in the region. That's going to build off the last couple of lectures. So I recommend going and watching those lectures before watching this one. Now, let me share my screen here with you. All right, so I have several goals here that I'm going to really try to aim for as I go through this lecture on imperialism. Number one, we've got to understand first what exactly is imperialism and what are its causes. And more specifically, why the Europeans engaged in it in the Middle East, right? So what were some of the general causes here? And finally, we're going to also understand the differences and similarities of imperialism across this region. And we're going to zoom in on two case studies, French Algeria and British Egypt. So French Algeria is going to be a case of what we call direct imperialism, where the Europeans actually ruled directly over these colonies, whereas Egypt is going to be a case of indirect imperialism. We're also going to see great differences in these colonies in terms of how imperialism came about. Whereas with French Algeria, it was mainly military, it was very rapid. With Britain and Egypt, it was slow. And it came in the form first of what we call soft imperialism until finally the British invaded in 1882. So imperialism manifested itself in very different ways across this region. And we're also going to as well talk about some of the implications of imperialism in the region. What were some of the consequences of that? So first things first, what exactly is imperialism? Well, you might notice within this term the word empire, right? So imperialism is a policy of one country expanding its power over others, okay? And there's various ways you can do this. The most obvious is militarily, right? If you are more powerful than another country, you might be able to conquer it. But this is not the only way to influence the politics of other countries. You could do so, for example, economically. If you're a powerful economic power, you could loan money, for example, to other countries or give it aid. And you might then expect some things in return for that. So you could control the policies of another country by using economic leverage. We also see that in today's world with things like economic sanctions, right, where you punish other countries economically, such as cutting off trade with them if they do not make changes domestically to their politics. And finally, there's something called soft power, where you can use cultural discourse. So if you're a country that's attracting a lot of migrants, if you're a country that is really attracting a lot of interest because you're dynamic, you're leading the way in terms of education and technological development, other countries might want to copy you. And so this could lead to a kind of soft imperialism. So that's what imperialism is all about. It's when one country tries to influence the policies of another. Now, Europe in particular, because this is where modernization started. If you listen to my lecture, my my fifth lecture on the Middle East, we talked a lot about the rise of modern Europe. And because modernity started in this part of the world, this is going to lead to the Europeans becoming this great imperial power. They're going to conquer most of the globe. And imperialism in the Middle East is going to start specifically in the 1800s, first with Algeria and then with other colonies in the aftermath of that. So modernization, it gave Europeans dominance because A, they were the first to industrialize. They were able to mass produce weapons and goods. This gave them both military and economic dominance. And they also created the world's first modern states, these powerful militaries, these powerful states and bureaucracies that gave them the ability to influence the rest of the world. And the two big powers that emerged from this in the 1800s were England and France, specifically because England was the first to industrialize and the French followed. And industrialization was particularly important because they developed the ability to mass produce weapons. Now, the Ottoman and Qajar empires did have guns in this time period, but they didn't have the ability to mass produce them. They didn't have factories. They didn't have the type of modern states that the Europeans had. And so this gave the English and French a big leg up on the rest of the world during this era. Now, this explains why England and France were able to conquer parts of the Middle East during the 1800s and the early 1900s. But it doesn't explain the motives for imperialism. Why go out and conquer these other parts of the world? Like, why do this? So there are a couple of factors at play here. Number one, Europe itself was divided amongst these competing nation states. England, France, later Germany and Italy, Russia, that were trying to compete with each other for political power. They were fighting in wars in Europe, the Napoleonic Wars, World Wars I and II, for example, later in the 20th century. And in this competition, they were seeking to expand their power out into the rest of the world to obtain resources, to obtain access to trade routes. And so, thus, this kind of nationalist competition for power led them towards imperialism. Now, there's other factors as well. As these states began to industrialize and create factories and mass produce goods, they needed the resources to be able to mass produce these goods. So, for example, if you want to be able to mass produce clothing, you need a crop like cotton. And so, thus, finding places in the world that could grow this cash crop became very valuable. Right? In fact, cotton was grown in the southern United States in the 1800s. It was also grown in Egypt, for example. We talked last lecture about how Muhammad Ali started to grow cotton and export it to Great Britain. There was also a need as well for fossil fuels, first coal and then later oil and natural gas. And as you're going to find out, the Middle East has a lot of this. And so if you go out and colonize other parts of the world, you could get access to these resources. And since these countries in Europe were competing, they also didn't want their competitors to get access to these goods. So there was this scramble to get colonies and conquer the rest of the world. Now, part of this as well, if you want to be able to conquer these colonies and then send these goods back to the homeland, to the motherland, you need to have access to trade routes and open access to the high seas, right? And so part of their efforts here with imperialism were to basically promote trade overseas and to stop things like piracy and slavery. Okay, so you can't trade your goods if pirates are taking things from your merchant ships. And part of the problem that the Europeans had with some of the Ottoman provinces in North Africa is they were engaging in a lot of piracy and they were enslaving a lot of Christian merchants. And so they wanted to put an end to this. Now, on top of this as well, some Europeans also had as a motivation this idea that they were going to spread civilization, quote unquote civilization, to other parts of the world, that they were going to spread Christianity and European norms. This was known in France, for example, as the civilizing mission, right? And this became a justification for this. Obviously, you can't justify the conquest of other countries as we're going to take this country's resources, right? That doesn't sound very moral. So they often frame these conquests on the basis of we're going to bring civilization to the Middle East and North Africa and these other parts of the world. So there was this cultural justification for it. Now, a couple of other things that are important in terms of justification. Last lecture, you guys learned, right, that you had a lot of these reformers in the Ottoman Empire and in other parts of the Middle East and North Africa, such as Muhammad Ali in Egypt, that wanted to make reforms, right? So they began to invest in modernization. Now, some of these reformers, such as during the Tanzimat era in the Ottoman Empire, began to take out a lot of loans from European banks. Okay, and as a result, they became severely in debt to these Europeans. And this became another reason for the Europeans to influence the affairs of the Middle East. And last but not least, as Europe began to industrialize, its populations ballooned. And there was this growing demand for land and access to resources amongst individuals. And so thus colonization becomes this opportunity to go out and find new lands for their growing populations. And you're going to see that this was the case with Algeria. So these are all the different motives here for imperialism. We have a bunch of them. And just to kind of exemplify how this imperialism was justified, I'm going to show you here this political cartoon that kind of exemplifies the civilizing mission, as well as a lot of the racist rhetoric that was used to justify colonialism. This comes from a journal from France called Le Petit Journal, right? So the little journal. And you can see here there is this text at the bottom of this image here, and it says France will be able to bring civilization, wealth, and peace really to Morocco. So this is in the year 1911. It's actually the year the French conquered Morocco. So let's analyze this image to see what's going on here, right? So number one, we have this larger than life lady. This represents Lady Liberty, okay? So kind of image of this civilizing mission of France. In fact, you might know of the Statue of Liberty. That was actually a gift from France to the United States. So similar image here. And so what's happening here? Well, Lady Liberty is doing something for the poor peoples of Morocco here. Number one, she's giving books. You can see that one of the individuals here is reading a book. And she's also giving financial wealth. So wealth is pouring from her. So what are the justifications of colonization here? Well, we're going to bring knowledge, scientific knowledge. We're going to bring democracy. We're going to bring wealth to the native peoples here. So it's pouring out here. And notice in the background here, we have, a French officer guiding this Moroccan officer here, instructing him on how to build a modern military. And we also see here the plow. So Lady Liberty is going to teach these people new modern methods with agriculture and economic development. Now, we also notice various racist tropes here, right? So notice the imagery here. Okay, we see these people being depicted as having very dark skin. We see the people here as being depicted as kind of savages, right? So this is part of the kind of racist imagery that was used in the late 19th and the early 20th century. And so here it's kind of a white man savior complex. We're going to go to these poor regions of the world and we are going to bring civilization to them. Now, of course, a problem with this discourse is that many parts of the Middle East and North Africa were already on the way towards modernization. We learned about this last lecture, right? Urbanization was already starting to grow, literacy was already starting to grow. So this idea that these parts of the world couldn't do it without European conquest, I think this is very problematic, right? So that's number one. And number two, you're also going to find out in this lecture that the Europeans weren't exactly always enlightened in terms of how they, quote unquote, brought modernization to this region. They're going to engage in conquest. There's going to be a lot of violence involved. And as you're going to find out, the Europeans are not going to be very interested in bringing industry or democratization. They were more interested in extracting natural resources from their colonies rather than bringing about all aspects of modernization. So let's go into our examples now. Example number one, Algeria. So this is our country here, Algeria. Just a couple of things about this case study before I kind of go into why the French conquered it and what they did there. Today, France, very large country territorially. It's got about 46 million people. The vast majority of these people are located on this coastal strip here. There are rains that come from the Mediterranean Sea. There's a lot of good agricultural lands along the coasts. Then you have this mountain range called the Atlas Mountains and the Sahara Desert. Most people do not live past this small coastal strip. In fact, the term Algeria comes from this name Algiers, the capital of the country. And in Arabic, we pronounce it El Jazair, which means the islands. And you might be saying, why do we call it the islands? It's not an island. Well, it's a metaphorical term because Algiers and the other coastal cities like Oran, Constantine, they are surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea and the desert. Okay, so it's a metaphorical set of islands that exist here along this thin coastal strip. And so this is where most of the people live today. Now, a couple of important things about the history of this country. The indigenous peoples don't speak Arabic. They speak a set of languages called Amazigh, and the And most of these people today live in the Atlas mountain ranges and in the deserts of the Sahara. So they consist of about 35% of the population today. So if you go to the Atlas Mountains, if you go to the Sahara, this is where you'll find these indigenous peoples. A couple of other important things about this colony. It was invaded by the Arab Muslims in the 7th century. We talked about that in a previous lecture. So during this century, the Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula invaded the Middle East and North Africa. They spread the Islamic faith and they spread the Arabic language. Most of the Amazigh that lived along the coastal region, they're going to intermarry with the Arabs. They're going to learn how to speak the Arabic language. They're going to adopt Islam. And what's going to happen is Islam is going to slowly spread into the interior and into the Sahara, but many of these people would keep the Amazigh language. So we have a situation today where 99% of the country is Muslim, 65% of those Muslims speak Arabic, and about 35% of those Muslims continue to speak one of a variety of Amazigh languages in this country. Now, a couple of the other important things for our story with Algeria. It became an Ottoman province in 1516. It became part of this very large empire called the Ottoman Empire. I talked about this in a previous lecture, and it was ruled by the Ottomans for several centuries. Okay. Now, as we also discussed in a previous lecture, the Ottoman Empire began to decline in the 17th century, and many of its provinces gained a lot of autonomy. Okay, and this was the case of Algeria. In 1671, the Algerian governors, known as the Deys, gained relative autonomy. They still consider themselves as a part of the Ottoman Empire and continue to give tribute to the Ottomans, who are based in Istanbul, but they were not ruled directly by the Ottomans. The governors pretty much had control over the provinces. And at a certain point, the Ottoman Empire, the sultans lost the ability to even choose the governor. A group of slave soldiers known as the Janissaries based in Algeria, they gained the ability to decide who would become the new Dey once the previous governor died. So every time a governor died, these slave soldiers, the officers amongst them, would choose the new governor. So this represents the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of modern Europe. Now, at the same time, as trade declined in the Middle East and North Africa, and a lot of the wealth was lost in this part of the world, many of the individuals within Algeria became increasingly dependent on piracy off the coast here. They began to raid a lot of ships. In fact, Algeria became known as a Barbary state, engaging in a lot of piracy. And this really, this angered a lot of Europeans. It angered the French, the Spanish, it angered the British, it even angered the Americans, right? So we talked about last lecture how America's first foreign war was with another province of the Ottoman Empire in Tripoli. So you get these Barbary states that end up engaging in a lot of piracy. And eventually, this is going to lead to French colonialism in 1830. We're going to talk more about this in a second. So this is just a background on Algeria, right? Some of the basic facts about this country, just to understand why France colonized this country in 1830. Now, the incident that's going to lead to French colonization is known as the fly whisk incident. So this is a very colorful episode in Algeria's history. In 1827, a French diplomat went to visit the Ottoman Dey to talk about a couple of diplomatic issues. Now, the Ottoman Dey was angry with the French because during the Napoleonic Wars before 1815, the Algerians had loaned the French military some grain, which the French never paid back. So he was angry about that. Now, the French, for their part, they were angry about piracy and the continuation of slavery in Algeria. On top of this as well, the French themselves were going through some internal turmoil. There was a lot of push for democratization. In fact, in 1830, France would experience its second revolution. And so there was a lot of turmoil itself in France during this era. So lots of diplomatic tensions here as a consequence of this between France and Algeria. And during this meeting, in 1827, the Ottoman Sultan, with this fly whisk you could see in his hand, slaps the French diplomat in the face. And so this leads to some bad blood here. And eventually, the French, they make their plans to invade Algeria as a consequence of this. And so in 1830, the French decide to take Algeria. And, of course, there were a lot of other motives that we talked about at the beginning of this lecture. The desire for more land and access to agriculture, the desire to spread French influence throughout the globe, expand its empire, expand its access to resources. Now, the French invade the capital Algiers in 1830, and the day's government collapses. Okay, and with it, the influence of these Turkish slave soldiers. But the Arabs in the countryside put up really stiff resistance. You had a coalition of these Arab tribes that didn't want to be ruled by the Europeans for obvious reasons, right? Europeans were Christians, they had a different religion, a different way of life. And so they tried to resist European rule. Now, what enabled them to put up such a resistance for 18 years is that the British, the longtime enemy of the French, decided to step in and give some weapons to these fighters, right? And this group of Arab tribes, it was led by this man named Abdul Qadir. He was a very famous Sayyid, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, and a leader of a Sufi order. It's a mystical order within Algeria. And he had a lot of support amongst the Algerian population, amongst a lot of the Arabs, as well as a lot of the Amazigh in the country. Very popular figure. He was kind of like, the Pancho Villa of Algeria. So Pancho Villa was a famous rebel in Mexico during the Mexican Civil War in the early 20th century. So Abdul Qadir, very famous rebel. He leads this resistance, and it's going to take the French about 18 years to gain a control of northern Algeria and these agriculturally productive provinces in the Atlas Mountain ranges. And so you get this resistance and you get a lot of British weapons flooding into this region, right? So much for this kind of civilizing mission. It starts off pretty badly, right? And with a lot of violence and bloodshed in the process. Tens of thousands of Algerians are killed. Many are displaced from their lands until 1848, the French declare victory here. And this is, you can see on a map here, the conquest. It started with Algiers and they gradually go down south. They actually wouldn't conquer the rest of what would become modern Algeria until the late 1800s. They wouldn't conquer most of the desert here until then. So, the conquest was slow, but by 1848, the most important lands, the agricultural ones, had been conquered. Now, this was France's first big colony in Africa and in the Middle East. And there was this big desire amongst many Frenchmen for land. It was right across the Mediterranean. It was convenient for settlers, good Mediterranean climate. You could grow a lot of French crops there, like, you could have vineyards there. You could grow up. You could have olive trees, for example. So it attracted a lot of settlers. And thus, the French wanted to rule this colony directly. And so what does direct rule mean? It means when an imperialist conquers a country and rules it directly. And so they send their own citizens over there, they colonize it, they set up farms, they set up new cities, and they rule over it. And so from 1848 until the end of colonization in 1962, the French are going to rule over Algeria, and they're going to do so using a lot of brutality in the process. Over 1 million French settlers came to northern Algeria from 1830 to 1962. It's a very large number of people. And in the process of doing that, the Arabs, the Arab elites that live there, the landowners, the Arab and Turkish elites are going to lose access to their agricultural lands as well as their political power. Okay, so they're going to be shoved off their lands, and many of them as well are going to be forced to move to cities, and they're going to be ghettoized in the process of this. Now, Algeria was treated by France as a part of France. In fact, the three major cities of Algiers, Constantine, and Oran, so these three major cities, were treated as electoral districts. Frenchmen had the ability to vote in these elections. They could send representatives to French parliaments. The French themselves set up modern democratic governance within this colony, right? So they introduced elections here. They built a modern infrastructure. They're going to build roads, bridges, railways. They're going to build modern style European cities on the outskirts of Algiers, Constantine and Oran. So they're going to try to create a modern state here, right? And they're going to integrate Algeria into France. So it becomes a part of France as a consequence of this. But here's the thing that's important, okay, to keep in mind. The Arab Muslims could not vote, okay, and in fact, they lived under military rule. They had a separate set of rules for them. They had no choice. They had no ability to choose their own elected officials, and they were severely oppressed here. This is kind of like apartheid in South Africa, where the white Europeans were segregated from the African populations. So Arab Muslims could not vote or live under military, and they could not form a civil society. They didn't have freedom of speech. They did not have civil liberties living under the French here. And so, the French, for their part, why did they claim they were doing this civilizing mission? Well, they were investing in a modern infrastructure. They built universities in Algeria. They built railways. They built ports. So they invest in modernity here, but they exclude the Arab Muslim population as a consequence. Now, the French also did something else, right? So, it's difficult to suppress an entire population, right? You don't want them all uniting against you and forming a single cohesive bloc, right? So what the French did to try to control these people they ruled over was what's called divide and conquer. So how did they do this? So, well, number one, Jewish Arabs and Christians that lived in French Algeria could obtain citizenship and the right to vote, right? So those religious minorities, they suddenly get the right to vote. So it flips the script here. So under Ottoman rule, you have this situation where the people of the book, these monotheist minorities like Christians and Jews were treated as second-class citizens. Now it's the Arab Muslims that are going to be treated as second-class citizens. So Jewish Arabs and Christians are going to get the right to vote. And this is actually going to intensify conflict between these religious groups in the country. The French as well are going to proselytize. They're going to try to spread Christianity in this country. Now, on top of this as well, the Amazigh, were recruited into the French military and educational institutions. They weren't made French citizens, but they did get some perks and benefits, right? They're going to build some French-style schools and universities. So, for example, there was this group of the Amazigh called the Kabylie that lived on the outskirts of Algiers in the Atlas mountain ranges, and they were allowed to get access to an education. They were allowed to join the French bureaucracy and the military. So this is a way to co-opt some people. Now, you might say, what's the purpose of doing this? What it does is it creates different classes of subjects, some of which have some benefits over others. And what it does is it divides the opposition and makes it harder for them to unite together. And we see this type of inequality and divides even within the spatial layout of Algeria. So within the capital, Algiers, you had the old traditional city known as the Kasbah. Kasbah is an Arabic word for citadel. The old city had these traditional walls that surrounded it and a citadel that guarded it. And so you had the old city that had the Arab Muslim population with its mosques, with its traditional culture. And you had the new city, the modern city, built in the style of Paris, built on the outskirts. This city was from the Europeans. It had European universities. It had European institutions, modern coffee houses. It had theaters and opera houses. It was built to be like Europe, and it was segregated, much like you had segregation in apartheid South Africa. So you get this divide here in Algiers between the conquered and the conquerors. And for their part, the French did invest in some aspects of modernization here. To be fair, right? They built a modern infrastructure. They built railways, transportation, and communication networks. And when Algeria does gain independence, the modern state is going to benefit from some of these things, right? And so at the same time, though, it was an oppressive political system, and in many ways it was humiliating. So, for example, much of what the French did is they distributed a lot of lands to Frenchmen, and a lot of these lands were used to grow grapes and vineyards, right? Wine was produced in French Algeria. The French loved their wine, and you might say, why is this a big problem? Well, alcohol is forbidden within Islam. It's prohibited by Sharia law. So this was a big problem for the Arab Muslim population. Now, just last thing about direct rule before I go into my Egyptian case study. This was actually relatively rare in the Middle East and North Africa. The type of rule in French Algeria just was not common. The only other case study where we find a direct rule where the Europeans came in and ruled directly was in Libya. Libya was a case where the Italians conquered it in 1911. They ruled it until 1945, the end of World War II, when they lost control of the colony. And you had Italian citizens coming to Libya, settling down. They forced the Arab Muslim populations off their land. Massacres were committed. In fact, many accused the Italians of having committed genocide here. The Italian government would later apologize for what happened. It was brutal Italian rule, and it was ruled in a very similar way to how French Algeria was ruled here. So only other case that was direct rule. We're also going to talk a bit about Palestine and Israel and Jewish settler colonialism, but that's going to have its own unique set of dynamics. So we're going to have a whole special unit on that issue later. Now, our other case study. So in the more common type of European rule, indirect rule, took place with Egypt. And in order to talk about imperialism in Egypt, we have to talk about the building of the Suez Canal, why it took place, and how this is going to lead to the British conquering Egypt. Now, to get into this story, a very famous ruler of Egypt, a modernizing ruler, the Ottoman governor Muhammad Ali, who introduced those great reforms in the early 19th century. We talked about that in a previous lecture. Make sure to watch that to kind of understand this. He dies in 1846. And after his death, he died, by the way, very depressed because his attempts at reforming Egypt are going to end up failing. His attempts at industrialization failed, and he's going to be forced to open up Egypt to free trade with the British, right? So when he dies in 1846, his sons Abbas I and Pasha Said are going to succeed him one at a time. Abbas ruled from 1849 to 1854, and Pasha Said ruled from 54 to 63. And so Muhammad Ali, while Egypt was technically a province of the Ottoman Empire, he had created a monarchy here that, for all intents and purposes, ruled Egypt independently. Now, his first son, Abbas I, was relatively conservative. He didn't make much in the way of reforms. But his other son, Pasha Said, was a Francophone. He was heavily influenced by the French, and he was very much influenced by French diplomats. And this is going to be an important part of our story here. Pasha Said was educated in Paris, and he also, as well, was highly influenced by a French diplomat named Ferdinand de Lesseps. Now, a kind of colorful story about Pasha Said. He was a bit overweight. Now, his father, Muhammad Ali, very famous conqueror, he wanted to try to get his son in shape, and he ordered his cooks, don't cook bad food for my son. And so if Pasha Said wanted to get a good meal, he would go over the house of Ferdinand de Lesseps, and he would often feed him pasta. And he became very good friends as a child, and eventually Ferdinand de Lesseps really influenced him very heavily. So this is an example of European soft power. The Europeans had diplomats in various parts of the Middle East trying to influence Ottoman dignitaries, the Qajars in Iran, the Moroccan Sultanate, and so on and so forth. And so Ferdinand de Lesseps really got in the ear of this kid and began to influence him. And one of the things that the French were really interested in doing was building something called the Suez Canal in Egypt. Now, what was the Suez Canal? Well, it was built, okay, from 1859 to 1869. And what it did is it connected the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Now, it separated the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean by the Sinai Peninsula, this desert. And so, what the French wanted to do was build a canal that would connect these two bodies of water. And what it would do is cut down the traffic, okay, that would go from Europe to India and China. Okay, previously you had to sail all the way around Africa to get to India and China. But if you built the Suez Canal, you could cut the traffic by over 5,000 miles. Now, the French wanted to build it because if you build this, you dominate the trade from Europe to India. And what they wanted to do basically was to hurt British influence in India. So the British did not like this at all. The French wanted to get this built. And so in 1854, de Lesseps convinced Said to build this. Now, here's the thing. Muhammad Ali, his father, never wanted to build the Suez Canal. De Lesseps had tried to convince Muhammad Ali to do it, and Muhammad Ali said, hell no. And there were two reasons for this. Number one, Muhammad Ali realized he would have had to take out a lot of loans. This was a very expensive project, and he didn't want to take out loans from Europeans, right? Because you become indebted to them. Number two, the other big reason is that he felt that by building this, it would basically put a target on the back of the Egyptians. It would turn Egypt into something that was geostrategically important. He didn't want the British or French to conquer Egypt, right? If you build the canal, suddenly Egypt becomes more strategic. So he refused to do so. But Pasha Said becomes convinced, right? And the French, they told him, hey, this is great for modernization. You could collect money off the ships going through this canal. And so basically, Pasha Said gets convinced to do something that was actually against Egyptian interests. So very interesting story about how this gets built. And so, Ferdinand de Lesseps also told Said, oh, it's not going to cost that much. Don't worry. It's going to be relatively cheap. And once you build the canal, you're going to make money off of this. Now, in order to build this thing, they had to build three new cities along the canal in order to supply workers with resources. They also built a series of railways throughout Egypt, and so built a series of roads through the desert to supply all of these workers to build the canal. In order to build the canal as well and to raise the financing for it, Pasha Said allows de Lesseps to set up what's called the Suez Canal Company, which was partly owned by the French, and they begin to issue stock so that Europeans can invest in this canal. And it's going to be the French that are going to have a big stake in this, and the Egyptian monarchy are going to invest some of their resources and own part of this company so they can make money off the canal. So it was a joint venture. Both the French, the Egyptians could make money off the canal itself. And so what happened from 1859, when they finally raised enough money, to 1869, a period of 10 years, they're going to build this canal. It's going to be an incredibly expensive project, much more expensive. They had to dig out sand across hundreds of miles from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. And a lot went wrong. So there were a lot of complications and engineering complications. Tens of thousands die in its construction. And on top of that, of course, not many people are going to want to go to the middle of the desert to dig. At first, they had peasants digging with their bare hands. They conscripted by force the peasantry to go and build this canal. Tens of thousands of people died. And in fact, the British accused the French and the Egyptians of engaging in slavery here, which was technically supposed to be outlawed in the Ottoman Empire. So very controversial what took place here. And the costs just ballooned. And over time, the Egyptians had to take out more and more loans. And they started, as well, as you're going to find out later, eventually they're going to have to sell their shares in the Suez Canal just to pay to finish this thing, as well as to pay off their debts. So, this was a big complication. Now, on top of this as well, the British strongly opposed the building of this canal at first. They tried to sabotage it. They tried to get in the way. They tried to convince Europeans not to build it. They basically told all other countries throughout Europe, don't invest in the canal. This will give French dominance over global trade. So a lot goes wrong here. I recommend watching this video here. You can learn more about the canal by watching it specifically. So go and click on that link. And so here we have just a map here that I could show you just to kind of outline this. Here's France here, here's Great Britain, and here is Egypt. And we have here the Suez Canal. The Mediterranean used to be separate from the Red Sea, but because of this canal, it connected them. And it basically shortened the distance from Europe to India and China, by thousands of miles, right? So this saves you a lot of money on shipping, but it also makes the Egyptians a target for European conquests. And it also put the Egyptians greatly in debt. And so the canal was eventually finished. Now, Pasha Said is not going to live to see it finished. He dies in 1863, and his son, Ismail Pasha, another Francophone educated in Paris, he's going to come into power in 1863. And during his reign, the country grew severely in debt to the Europeans. Now, initially, there was an economic boom from in the 1860s in Egypt because of the American Civil War. A lot of cotton wasn't being sent to Europe because of that war, so the price of cotton skyrocketed. The Egyptians were exporting more cotton, and so Ismail Pasha decides to take out a lot more loans from Europe, not only to build this canal, but also to build 3 new cities, to increase, the amount of railways in the country. So these modernization projects took place. But Ismail as well, because he was this kind of absolute monarch, he spent a lot of money on these glamorous projects, and we get a lot of corruption here. He builds a new downtown in Cairo, the capital of Egypt, on the style of Paris, with these wide boulevards, this Belle Epoque architecture, very fancy architecture with these beautiful facades, but it was very expensive. And in the process, he builds a lot of palaces to himself on the coast in Alexandria, in Cairo, and down south in Luxor. He starts to build all these palaces. And we're talking in the style of Versailles, lots of luxury here, wasting the state's treasury in the process. So lots of mistakes were made here, lots of corruption. Suddenly, the country grows more and more in debt. And basically, the proverbial shit hits the fan here in 1873. In 1873, the world's first global depression as a result of industrialization and globalization takes place. And it happened as a result of over speculation in things like railways. In fact, a lot of railroads were built in Egypt. And so there was this big depression. And suddenly the global economy slows down, which means less people are buying cotton. On top of that, by this time, the American Civil War had ended. American cotton comes back on the market. Egypt's economy is doing very poorly. Suddenly, it can no longer pay back its debts. And so what it has to do is, first, it sells all of its shares in the Suez Canal. Very ironically, it built this canal to modernize Egypt, but suddenly it loses control of it. And it's the British that suddenly swoop in. They bid for their stock, and they spend a lot of money to buy this stock from Egypt in 1875. And suddenly they become the largest shareholder in the canal. And so the British and French share ownership in this canal. And in 1876, Ismail declares bankruptcy. The government goes bankrupt and he goes, we can't pay back the debts anymore. What can we do? And so the Europeans, the French and the British say, well, too bad. Either you pay back the debts or we invade. So this is a threat here. And in 1876, Ismail hires these French and British ministers to run the government. Okay. So we get this infiltration, this slow infiltration of Egyptian politics. And by 1876, basically the British and French are running the government. Now, in 1879, 3 years later, the Egyptian people, especially this emerging middle class, they start to grow angry about this. They don't like these new policies, right? They don't like the fact that the Europeans are infiltrating. And so there was this attempted revolt. And so Ismail, in the midst of protests, decides to try to fire these ministers to keep himself in power. But when he does that, the British say, get out or we're invading. And so they replace Ismail with this new monarch called Tufik Pasha. And this just angers the Egyptian population, okay? And it's going to lead to a revolt in the process. By the way, this is the downtown that was built by Cairo. As you can see here, Cairo's downtown, okay, looks very different from the way it was portrayed in Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, this Orientalist imagery. this is how Cairo's downtown actually looked like during when that movie was supposed to take place, believe it or not. It had this French style Belle Epoque architecture. You can see here these like kind of grand palaces here that were built outside the traditional Islamic city. So we get this new downtown built extremely expensive, also bankrupted the Egyptians in the process. So what happens eventually? This revolt takes place. The Egyptian military decides to overthrow Tewfik Pasha in 1879, and the leader of this revolt was Ahmed Urabi, who was anti-European. He wanted to kick the British and French ministers out, and this is called the Urabi Revolt, and Egypt's first revolution in its history. They overthrow these European ministers, and in the process, it was supported by this growing, middle class, particularly in this new modern downtown that didn't want these Europeans there. And so what happens is Arabi takes over the government for 3 years, and he threatens to kick the British and French out of the Suez Canal zone. And what happens is the British say, okay, now we have to invade, right? We have this valuable strategic canal there. We cannot let it fall into someone else's hands. Right. And on top of this as well, Arabi was calling for constitutional government and, he wanted to set up a democracy. And this is something that the British couldn't control. Right. And so what happens is in the process of all of this, the British invade in 1882 and they kick Arabi out of power. And in the process, they promised the French, look, we'll invade, we'll take over the canal militarily, but you get to keep your stake in the canal. And this avoided a war with the French over this. But Arabi, in the process, he gets overthrown. His short-lived rule comes to an end. And what happens here is the British become the masters of Egypt. But they take a very different tactic from the French here. They're not going to rule over Egypt directly. They're going to do something very different. They're going to rule over Egypt indirectly. And there's a variety of reasons for this. Indirect rule is where you will rely on local allies to run the country for you. You're going to rely on the indigenous peoples, right? You're not going to rule over directly. You're not going to send as many settlers there. Certainly, many thousands of British did move to Egypt during this time period, but it was nowhere near the levels of French Algeria. Instead, they're going to rely on the locals. Now, there's a couple of reasons why the British did this. Number one, they didn't want to conquer Egypt in the first place. They felt forced to do so. And on top of this as well, the British already had this expanding empire throughout the globe. It's their empire, the empire that, where the sun never set. And as their empire was growing at this time period, they didn't have enough people to rule over Egypt directly. And so they're going to rule over this indirectly. From 1882 to 1956, Egypt is going to be a British colony, but ruled in an indirect way. And it was called the Veiled Protectorate. Now, what a protectorate is when you prop up a local dynasty or a local monarchy, you keep it in power, and basically you just threaten that monarchy. What you tell them is if you do something that goes against our interest, we're going to overthrow you. So they prop up Muhammad Ali's dynasty back into power here. And so it was known as the Veiled Protectorate. Okay, and so what they basically told Muhammad Ali's dynasty and Tewfik Pasha, the new monarch, is look, you get to rule over domestic affairs, right? You can continue to be a monarchy, you could continue to have your palaces, your land holdings, you're still in power, but under a couple of conditions. Number one, you have to pay back your debts. That means you got to cut a lot of spending on modernization, and you have to open a free trade. You have to allow British merchants here as well as other European merchants. And also, we control foreign policy, and specifically the Suez Canal. We're going to keep troops in the Suez Canal, and we're going to run this canal for ourselves and the French. And as long as you do this, you could continue to be in power. And so a deal was made, and this monarchy was co-opted by the British state. And the British, well, they keep up this fiction that Egypt is still part of the Ottoman Empire in the process. They actually continue to claim, and of course, realistically, since the time of the Muhammad Ali, Egypt hadn't been really ruled by the Ottomans in Istanbul, right? It was really an autonomous province. But here it becomes even more of a fiction, right? It's called the Veiled Protectorate because they continue to keep up this idea that it was part of the Ottoman Empire. And part of the reason for this is the British didn't want the Ottoman Empire to collapse. They wanted to keep it as a buffer so the French and the Russians wouldn't expand into the rest of the Middle East. So, this was ruled indirectly here. And so very different from the Algerian experience. Okay. Now, the British did, like the French, invest in some infrastructure, but they were more interested in agricultural development. They wanted to grow more cotton, so they built some dams and irrigation networks, some new dikes were built, for example, here. But they invested very little in industry and education. In fact, about 10% of the Egyptian population was literate at the beginning of this era, and about 10% is going to be literate by the end. So only the Egyptian elites, members of the royal family, the elites that were in power before, that middle class that was there beforehand, is going to continue to get an education. So they're going to build universities. In fact, the American University in Cairo was built during this era. So schools and universities for foreigners and Egyptian elites were constructed. The British are going to build their social clubs. They're actually going to build some new neighborhoods on the outskirts of Cairo, and so on and so forth. But, and this is the big but, there is going to be no investments in industry here. And this is also how most of the rest of the colonies, and you're going to find out with later lectures, were also ruled. They were usually ruled indirectly in this way. In fact, even the French, learning from their hard experiences in Algeria, are going to decide to rule Tunisia and Morocco indirectly. They are going to prop up local monarchies to rule, and they're going to control foreign policy, right? And so Tunisia and Morocco were ruled very differently. And so here's a map here. So here, Egypt was ruled by the British. So this is on the eve of World War II. Libya was ruled by the Italians. Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco by the French, although Algeria was ruled directly, whereas Morocco and Tunisia ruled more indirectly. And as you can see, there were some other small powers here. The Spanish as well had a couple of their own territories here. So, European imperialism, very diverse reasons why it took place. And it's going to have ramifications for the region. It did introduce some aspects of modernity, but in a limited way. And it led to a spread of a lot of violence and discontent in this region. Now, next lecture, we're going to talk about the emergence of social movements that are going to impose imperialism, in this region, and I'm going to promote democratization. So I'll see you all next time.